The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Camilla Parker Bowles sat at her writing desk, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ornate envelope bearing the royal seal. The weight of the paper felt heavier than usual, and something in her heart told her that this correspondence would change everything she had worked so hard to build over the past decades. She had been queen consort for nearly 2 years now, a title she had never imagined she would hold when she first fell in love with Charles all those years ago. The journey had been long, filled with public scrutiny, media storms, and personal sacrifices that had tested every fiber of her being. Yet through it all, she had maintained her composure, her dignity, and her unwavering support for the man who had become king. The envelope remained unopened as memories flooded back to her childhood in East Sussex, where she had grown up in a loving family that valued tradition, loyalty, and service. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, had instilled in her the importance of duty and honor, while her mother, Rosalind, had taught her the grace and poise that would serve her well in the years to come. Her siblings, Mark and Annabelle, had always been her closest confidants, sharing in both the joys and challenges that life had brought their way. As she finally broke the seal and unfolded the crisp stationery, her eyes quickly scanned the formal language that characterized all official royal communications. But, as the words began to register, her breath caught in her throat. The document outlined a comprehensive restructuring of royal patronages, ceremonial roles, and financial arrangements that would effectively remove her family members from their positions within the royal framework. Her brother Mark, who had served with distinction in various honorary military positions, was to be relieved of his duties immediately. Her sister Annabelle, who had been quietly supporting numerous charitable organizations under the royal umbrella, would see her patronages transferred to other members of the family. Even her children from her first marriage, Tom and Laura, who had managed to carve out respectful roles within the extended royal circle, were being asked to step back from their involvement in royal functions. Camilla set the letter down with shaking hands, her mind racing to understand the implications of what she had just read. This was not merely an administrative reorganization. This was a deliberate and calculated move to isolate her from the support system that had helped her navigate the complexities of royal life. The timing felt particularly cruel, coming just as she had begun to feel truly settled in her role as queen consort. She walked to the large windows overlooking the garden, where she could see the gardeners tending to the rose bushes that had been planted in her honor. The irony was not lost on her that these beautiful flowers, symbols of love and devotion, were blooming just as her world seemed to be withering around the edges. The roses had thorns, just as her life had always been a mixture of beauty and pain, joy and sorrow. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her private secretary, informing her that several members of the media had already begun inquiring about changes to the royal household structure. Somehow, word of the reorganization had leaked, and the press was eager for statements and explanations. Camilla felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same sensation she had experienced countless times during the darker periods of her relationship with Charles. She remembered the years when she had been vilified in the press, painted as the other woman who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage. The headlines had been brutal, the photographs invasive, and the public sentiment overwhelmingly negative. She had endured it all with as much dignity as she could muster, knowing that her love for Charles was genuine and that their relationship, while complicated, was built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that had deepened over decades. But this felt different. This was not about her relationship with Charles or her fitness to be queen consort. This was about her family, people who had done nothing wrong except love and support her throughout her journey. They had stood by her during the most difficult times, never asking for recognition or reward, simply offering their presence and their loyalty when she needed it most. Her thoughts turned to her late parents, who had not lived to see her become queen but who had witnessed enough of her struggles to understand the price that came with loving someone in Charles's position. Her father had always been protective of his family's reputation, careful to maintain the dignity that their military heritage demanded. Her mother had been more openly supportive, offering comfort and wisdom during the periods when public opinion seemed overwhelmingly against her. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with royal advisors, protocol experts, and communication specialists, all working to manage the fallout from the leaked information about the family restructuring. Camilla sat through these sessions with practiced composure, nodding at appropriate moments and asking relevant questions, but her mind kept wandering to the human cost of these decisions. She thought about her brother Mark, a decorated military officer who had always conducted himself with honor and integrity. His involvement in royal functions had been minimal and always appropriate, focusing primarily on military ceremonies and veterans' affairs. He had never sought the spotlight or used his connection to the royal family for personal gain. The decision to remove him from his honorary positions seemed unnecessarily harsh and publicly humiliating. Her sister Annabelle had been even more discreet in her royal connections, working quietly behind the scenes to support charitable causes that aligned with royal values. She had never given interviews about her relationship with Camilla, never written books or articles about her inside knowledge of royal life. She had simply served where she was needed and remained silent when discretion was required. As evening approached, Camilla found herself alone in her private sitting room, surrounded by photographs that chronicled her life's journey. There were pictures from her first marriage, images of her children as young people, photographs from her early days with Charles, and more recent images from official royal functions. Each photograph told a story of adaptation, resilience, and gradual acceptance. She picked up a photograph from her son Tom's wedding, where the entire extended family had gathered to celebrate. Charles was visible in the background, smiling genuinely as he watched the proceedings. It had been one of those rare moments when the blended nature of their family had felt natural and harmonious, when the complications of royal protocol had taken a back seat to simple human happiness. The memory of that day now felt bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge that such gatherings would likely become more complicated going forward. The message embedded in the reorganization was clear. There was to be a more distinct separation between Camilla's role as queen consort and her identity as a member of the Parker Bowles family. The two aspects of her life, which she had worked so hard to integrate, were being forcibly separated. Her mobile phone buzzed with text messages from family members who had learned about the changes through various channels. The tone of these messages ranged from confusion to hurt to anger, but all of them shared a common thread of loyalty and support for Camilla herself. No one blamed her for the decisions that had been made, understanding that she was likely as surprised and upset as they were. Mark's message was particularly poignant. "Don't worry about us, Cam. We'll be fine. Just focus on your role, and don't let this distract you from the important work you're doing." The generosity of spirit in his words brought tears to her eyes, highlighting the unfairness of punishing such good people for no apparent reason other than their relationship to her. Camilla prepared for bed that evening with a heavy heart, knowing that the next few days would bring intense media scrutiny and public speculation about the reasons behind the royal restructuring. She would need to maintain her composure, continue with her scheduled appearances, and project an image of stability and confidence even as her personal world felt increasingly uncertain. As she turned off the lights in her bedroom, she could see the faint glow of security lights illuminating the gardens outside. Those lights had always provided a sense of safety and protection, but tonight they seemed to emphasize her isolation within the golden cage of royal life. She was queen consort of the United Kingdom, one of the most privileged positions imaginable, yet she felt more alone and vulnerable than she had in years. The pillow beneath her head was soft and luxurious, but sleep would not come easily. Her mind continued to race through the implications of the day's events, searching for explanations and solutions that remained frustratingly elusive. She found herself wondering if this was just the beginning of a larger reorganization that would further distance her from everything and everyone that had helped shape her into the woman she had become. In the quiet darkness of her room, Camilla allowed herself a few private tears for the family members who had been caught in the crossfire of royal politics. Tomorrow would require strength and dignity, but tonight she could grieve for the simplicity and security that seemed to be slipping away from all of them. The morning brought no relief from the emotional turmoil that had consumed Camilla's thoughts throughout the sleepless night. As her lady-in-waiting drew back the curtains, revealing another gray London day, the reality of her situation seemed even more stark in the pale daylight. The newspapers had already been delivered, and she could see the telltale signs of media frenzy in the way her staff moved with heightened urgency and whispered conversations. Her breakfast tray arrived with the usual selection of morning papers, but Camilla found herself reluctant to read the headlines that she knew would dissect every aspect of the royal restructuring. Instead, she focused on her correspondence, hoping that the routine of answering letters and reviewing her schedule might provide some sense of normalcy to what promised to be an extraordinarily difficult day. The first official meeting of the morning was with her private secretary, who briefed her on the media response and the various requests for statements that had poured in overnight. The coverage was exactly as she had feared, speculative, intrusive, and largely unsympathetic to the human cost of the administrative changes. Several prominent royal correspondents had already begun crafting narratives about power struggles within the royal household and questions about Camilla's influence over the king. What frustrated her most was the inaccuracy of many of these reports. The media seemed determined to portray her as either a victim of palace intrigue or as someone who had somehow orchestrated the removal of her own family members for strategic purposes. Neither characterization felt remotely accurate to her lived experience of the situation, but she had learned long ago that trying to correct every misrepresentation was a futile exercise. Her son Tom called during a brief break between meetings, his voice carefully controlled but clearly strained. He had been contacted by several journalists seeking comment on his changed status within the royal circle, and he was struggling to understand how to respond appropriately. Camilla found herself in the impossible position of trying to comfort and advise her child while having no real answers to offer him. "I don't understand why this is happening now," Tom said quietly. "Everything seemed to be going so well. You were settled in your role, the public seemed to be accepting you, and we had found a way to be part of your life without causing problems. What changed?" Camilla wished she had a satisfactory answer for him, but the truth was that she was as mystified as he was by the timing and scope of the restructuring. There had been no warnings, no gradual changes that might have prepared them for this dramatic shift. The decision had apparently been made at the highest levels without consultation or consideration for the personal impact on the individuals involved. "I think we just need to accept that this is how things are now," she told him, trying to keep her voice steady. "We can't control the decisions that are made, but we can control how we respond to them. Your father and I raised you to handle challenges with dignity, and that's what we need to do now." But even as she spoke these words of encouragement, Camilla felt the weight of her own uncertainty. She had always prided herself on her ability to adapt to changing circumstances, but this felt different from the challenges she had faced in the past. Those had been about public perception, media coverage, or protocol adjustments. This was about the fundamental structure of her support system and her ability to maintain connections with the people who mattered most to her. The afternoon brought a scheduled visit to a children's hospital, one of her regular charitable engagements that had been planned months in advance. Under normal circumstances, these visits were among her favorite royal duties, providing opportunities to connect with real people facing genuine challenges and to use her position to bring some comfort and attention to worthy causes. But today, every interaction felt complicated by the subtext of her personal situation. The medical staff and patients were gracious and welcoming, but she could see the questions in some of their eyes, the awareness that she was dealing with difficulties that were being discussed in every newspaper and television broadcast in the country. During a quiet moment between ward visits, she found herself in conversation with a young mother whose daughter was recovering from a serious surgery. The woman, apparently unaware of the morning's headlines, spoke openly about her own family struggles and the challenges of maintaining relationships during difficult times. "The hardest part," the mother said, "is when you feel like you can't protect the people you love from getting hurt. You want to shield them from the consequences of situations they didn't create, but sometimes you're powerless to do that." The words hit Camilla with unexpected force, perfectly articulating the frustration and helplessness she was feeling about her family's situation. This stranger, dealing with her own crisis, had unknowingly provided more insight and comfort than hours of meetings with royal advisors and protocol experts. As she continued through the hospital visit, Camilla found herself thinking about the strange isolation that came with her position. She was surrounded by people throughout every day, but most of those interactions were formal, scripted, and bounded by the requirements of royal protocol. Genuine human connections, like the brief conversation with the worried mother, were rare and precious. The drive back to Clarence House provided a few minutes of privacy in the back seat of the royal car, and Camilla allowed herself to acknowledge the full depth of her emotional exhaustion. The public aspects of her role demanded constant composure and engagement, but the private toll was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Her sister Annabelle was waiting for her when she arrived home, having requested an urgent meeting to discuss the practical implications of the restructuring. The two women embraced warmly, and Camilla was struck by how much comfort she drew from this simple gesture of family solidarity. Annabelle had always been the most emotionally intelligent member of their family, possessing an intuitive understanding of people and situations that had served her well throughout her life. She had been Camilla's closest confidant during the most difficult periods of her relationship with Charles, offering advice and support without judgment or conditions. "I've been thinking about this all day," Annabelle said as they settled in Camilla's private sitting room. "And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This isn't really about us at all. We're just collateral damage in some larger political calculation that we probably don't even understand." The observation was both comforting and disturbing. If Annabelle was right, then the personal pain and disruption they were experiencing was essentially meaningless in the broader context of royal decision-making. Their years of loyalty and discretion, their careful navigation of the complex requirements of royal association, had been swept aside by considerations that had nothing to do with their actual behavior or worthiness. "The question is," Annabelle continued, "how do we respond in a way that protects both you and the family's dignity? We can't fight this publicly without making things worse for you. But we also can't just disappear without acknowledging what's happening." It was a delicate balance that required careful consideration. Any public statements from family members would be scrutinized for signs of bitterness or criticism of the royal household. But complete silence might be interpreted as either guilt or weakness, neither of which accurately reflected their position. They spent the evening crafting careful responses to media inquiries, statements that expressed understanding and respect for royal decisions while maintaining their own dignity and integrity. The language had to be precise, acknowledging the changes without appearing to criticize them, expressing continued support for Camilla without seeming to question the wisdom of the restructuring. As Annabelle prepared to leave, she turned to her sister with an expression of fierce protectiveness. "You know that none of this changes anything about how we feel about you or our pride in everything you've accomplished. You've handled impossible situations with more grace than anyone could reasonably expect, and we'll always be proud to be your family." The simple sincerity of her words brought tears to Camilla's eyes, reminding her that some things remained constant even when everything else seemed to be shifting beneath her feet. The love and support of her family had been one of the few reliable constants throughout all the upheavals of her adult life, and knowing that it would continue regardless of official titles or formal roles provided a foundation of strength she desperately needed. But as she prepared for another restless night, Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger transformation that would ultimately redefine not just her family's relationship to the royal household, but her own understanding of what it meant to be queen consort. The ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she was still struggling to find her new balance in this altered landscape. 3 days had passed since the restructuring announcement, and Camilla found herself navigating a strange new reality where every interaction seemed charged with unspoken questions and careful diplomatic language. The palace machinery continued to function with its usual efficiency, but she could sense subtle changes in the way staff members approached her, a heightened awareness of boundaries and protocols that had previously felt more relaxed. Charles had been notably absent during these crucial days, engaged in a series of Commonwealth meetings that had been scheduled months in advance. Their brief phone conversations had been cordial but strained, touching on practical matters while carefully avoiding the emotional undercurrents that both of them could feel, but neither seemed willing to address directly. Camilla found herself wondering whether his absence was truly coincidental or whether it had been deliberately arranged to allow the situation to settle without his direct involvement. The morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Princess Anne, who arrived at Clarence's house with the kind of no-nonsense directness that characterized all of her interactions, and had always been one of the few members of the royal family who treated Camilla with consistent respect and genuine warmth, and her presence during this difficult period felt particularly meaningful. "I thought you might appreciate some straight talk," Anne said as they settled in the morning room with tea and biscuits. "This whole business has been handled badly, and I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with the decisions that have been made." The frank acknowledgement of disagreement within the royal family was both comforting and concerning. Camilla had always tried to avoid being seen as a source of division or conflict among family members, and the suggestion that her situation was creating internal tensions added another layer of complexity to her already difficult position. "Your family members have conducted themselves impeccably over the years," and continued. Mark in particular has been a credit to his military background and has never put a foot wrong in his ceremonial roles. The timing of these changes seems unnecessarily cruel, especially given how hard you've worked to establish yourself in your position. The support from someone of Anne's stature and experience within the royal system felt invaluable, but it also highlighted the political dimensions of what was happening. If senior members of the family were questioning the restructuring, it suggested that the decision had not emerged from unanimous consensus, but rather from a more contested internal process. Anne's visit lasted nearly 2 hours, during which they discussed both the practical implications of the changes and the broader patterns of royal decision-making that might help explain what had occurred. Anne's perspective, shaped by decades of royal service and her own experiences with media scrutiny and public criticism, provided insights that Camilla found both illuminating and disturbing. The institution has a way of protecting itself that doesn't always account for the human cost, and explained. Sometimes decisions are made based on abstract calculations about public perception or constitutional precedent, without sufficient consideration for the real people who get caught up in the machinery. The observation resonated deeply with Camilla's own sense of the situation. She had always understood that her position came with sacrifices and compromises, but she had believed that her family's discretion and loyalty would be recognized and protected. The discovery that even exemplary behavior could be discarded when it became inconvenient was a sobering reminder of the conditional nature of royal security. The afternoon brought a scheduled engagement at a literary festival, where Camilla was to present awards to emerging writers and participate in a panel discussion about the importance of reading and literacy. Under normal circumstances, these cultural events were among her most enjoyable official duties, allowing her to engage with creative people and support causes she genuinely cared about. But the presence of media cameras and journalists made every moment feel fraught with potential for misinterpretation. Her facial expressions were scrutinized for signs of distress or defiance. Her interactions with other attendees were analyzed for their warmth or distance, and her prepared remarks were dissected for hidden meanings or coded messages about her personal situation. During the panel discussion, a young writer asked about the challenges of maintaining authenticity while operating within institutional constraints. The question was clearly not directed specifically at Camilla's current circumstances, but she felt the weight of its relevance as she formulated her response. I think authenticity is about staying true to your core values even when external circumstances change, she said carefully. Sometimes that means adapting your methods or your approach, but it doesn't mean abandoning what matters most to you. The challenge is finding ways to express your authentic self within whatever framework you're operating in. The answer felt honest without being revelatory, diplomatic without being evasive. But, as she spoke the words, Camilla realized that she was still struggling to define exactly what authenticity meant in her current position. Was it more authentic to publicly defend her family and risk creating further complications, or to accept the institutional decisions with grace even when they felt personally devastating? The return journey to Clarence's house provided time for reflection on the strange duality of her existence. In public, she was required to project confidence, stability, and contentment with her role as queen consort. In private, she was grappling with feelings of powerlessness, confusion, and grief for the relationships and connections that were being forcibly altered. That evening brought a phone call from her daughter Laura, who had been struggling with her own responses to media inquiries and social media speculation about the family's changed status. Laura had always maintained a deliberately low profile, avoiding the public attention that came with royal connections and focusing on her own professional and personal pursuits. I keep getting messages from friends asking if we've done something wrong, Laura said, her voice tight with frustration. People seem to think there must be some scandal or problem that explains why we're being pushed out. I don't know how to explain that sometimes these things just happen for reasons that ordinary people don't understand. Camilla felt a familiar surge of protective anger on behalf of her children, who had never asked to be part of the royal world but had been swept up in its complexities through no choice of their own. They had handled their unusual circumstances with remarkable maturity and discretion, but they shouldn't have to defend themselves against implications of wrongdoing when their only crime was being related to her. The best thing we can do, Camilla told her daughter, is to continue living our lives with dignity and integrity. People who know us understand that we haven't done anything wrong, and the opinions of people who don't know us shouldn't matter. But I know that's easier to say than to actually feel. The conversation with Laura highlighted one of the most painful aspects of the entire situation, the way it affected people who had no real voice in royal decision-making, but who had to live with the consequences of choices made by others. Her children and siblings were private citizens who had never sought public roles, but they found themselves subject to public scrutiny and judgment because of their family connections. As she prepared for bed that evening, Camilla found herself thinking about the nature of sacrifice and service in the context of royal life. She had always understood that her position would require personal sacrifices, and she had been willing to make them in service of the institution and her love for Charles. But the extension of those sacrifices to her family members felt like a violation of an unspoken agreement she thought she had made. The photographs on her dressing table seemed to mock her with their images of happier times, family gatherings where the complexities of royal protocol had been temporarily set aside in favor of simple human connection. She wondered whether such moments would still be possible going forward, or whether the invisible barriers that were being constructed would make even private family interactions more complicated and constrained. Sleep remained elusive, her mind churning through endless variations of conversations she wished she could have and decisions she wished she could influence. The powerlessness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire situation, the sense that she was being carried along by forces beyond her control toward a destination she couldn't clearly see and wasn't sure she wanted to reach. But somewhere in the darkness of her sleepless hours, Camilla began to feel the first stirrings of a different kind of determination. If she couldn't control the institutional decisions that were being made around her, she could at least control her own responses to them. And, perhaps, in time, she could find ways to protect and support the people she loved within whatever constraints were being imposed upon them. All that a week had elapsed since the initial shock of the restructuring announcement, and Camilla found herself settling into a new rhythm of carefully managed composure that masked the ongoing emotional turbulence beneath the surface. The initial media frenzy had begun to subside, replaced by a more sustained but less intense level of speculation and analysis that she had learned to navigate through years of public scrutiny. Charles finally returned from his Commonwealth tour on a gray Thursday morning, and their reunion at Clarence House was marked by the kind of formal politeness that characterized their interactions during periods of stress. He looked tired from his travels, but there was something else in his demeanor that suggested his absence had been as much about internal reflection as it had been about royal duties. They sat together in his private study, surrounded by the books, paintings, and personal artifacts that had always provided him with comfort and inspiration. The room felt familiar, yet somehow changed, as if the events of the past week had altered the emotional resonance of even the most intimate spaces in their shared home. "I know this has been difficult for you," Charles said finally, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken conversations and decisions made in rooms she had never entered. "I want you to understand that these changes weren't made lightly, and they weren't intended to cause you personal pain." The carefully neutral language felt inadequate to address the magnitude of what had occurred, but Camilla recognized the constraints under which he was operating. As king, his personal feelings and preferences had to be balanced against institutional considerations that she could only partially understand. The man she loved was also the head of an ancient system that operated according to its own logic and imperatives. "I'm trying to understand the reasoning," she replied, choosing her words with equal care. "But it's difficult to separate the institutional necessities from what feels like a personal rejection of people who have done nothing but support us both throughout everything we've been through." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest and painful they had shared in years. Charles explained, as much as his position allowed him to, the various pressures and considerations that had influenced the restructuring decision. There were concerns about public perception, questions about the appropriate scope of royal family involvement, and complex constitutional issues that she had never fully appreciated. But beneath the official explanations, Camilla sensed something more personal and troubling. There seemed to be advisors and courtiers who viewed her family's continued involvement as a liability, a reminder of the complicated circumstances that had brought her to her current position. The restructuring wasn't just about streamlining royal operations. It was about creating distance between the crown and the aspects of her personal history that some people found uncomfortable. "They see my family as a symbol of everything irregular about our marriage," she said quietly, finally, giving voice to the suspicion that had been growing in her mind. "They want to pretend that I emerged fully formed as queen consort, without the messy human relationships and family connections that remind people of who I was before. Charles didn't deny her assessment, which was perhaps more telling than any direct confirmation could have been. His silence spoke to the impossible position he found himself in, torn between his love for her and his duty to an institution that demanded certain sacrifices from all of its members. The days that followed their conversation brought a series of smaller adjustments and clarifications that gradually revealed the full scope of what was changing. Her family members were not being completely ostracized, but their roles were being significantly diminished, and their access to royal events was being carefully controlled. They would still be invited to major celebrations and family occasions, but their participation in the day-to-day workings of royal life was being systematically reduced. Camilla threw herself into her official duties with renewed intensity, perhaps hoping that demonstrated dedication to her role might somehow compensate for the disruption that had been caused. She attended charity events, visited hospitals and schools, and participated in ceremonial functions with the same gracious professionalism that had characterized her performance since becoming queen consort. But those closest to her could see the toll that the situation was taking. Her lady-in-waiting noticed that she had become more withdrawn between public appearances, spending long periods in contemplative silence that was uncharacteristic of her normally sociable nature. Her private secretary observed that she had begun declining optional social engagements, preferring to spend her free time in solitude or in the company of only her most trusted confidants. The emotional weight of the situation was compounded by her growing awareness of how the restructuring was affecting her family members' daily lives. Mark had begun receiving questions about his changed status from military colleagues and social acquaintances, forcing him to navigate awkward conversations about circumstances he couldn't fully explain. Annabelle had found herself in the uncomfortable position of stepping back from charitable organizations she had supported for years, disappointing people who had come to rely on her involvement. Most difficult for Camilla was watching her children struggle with the implications of their altered relationship to royal life. Tom and Laura had worked hard to establish their own independent identities, but they couldn't completely escape the associations that came with being her children. The restructuring had made their positions more ambiguous and potentially more vulnerable to future changes. During a private family dinner at her country home, Camilla found herself surrounded by the people she loved most, all of them trying to maintain normal conversation while dealing with the underlying tension that none of them could entirely ignore. The evening was pleasant on the surface, filled with familiar jokes and shared memories, but she could sense the careful editing that everyone was doing to avoid topics that might prove emotionally charged. It was her brother Mark who finally addressed the situation directly, raising his glass in a toast that brought tears to several eyes around the table. "To family," he said simply, "which is something that can never be restructured or reorganized by anyone else. Whatever titles or roles we may or may not have, we're still the same people who love and support each other." The simplicity and dignity of his words captured something essential that had been lost in all the formal language and institutional explanations of the past few weeks. Regardless of official positions or ceremonial roles, the fundamental relationships that had sustained her throughout her adult life remained intact and unalterable. But even as she felt comforted by her family's continued solidarity, Camilla couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her position and her future. The restructuring had revealed the conditional nature of royal security in ways that she had never fully grasped before. The protection and privileges that came with her title were real, but they came with boundaries and limitations that could be adjusted according to institutional needs she couldn't predict or control. That night, as she sat alone in her study reviewing correspondence and preparing for the next day's engagements, Camilla found herself thinking about the nature of identity and belonging in the context of royal life. She had spent years learning to balance her authentic self with the requirements of her position, but the recent events had forced her to confront questions about where those boundaries should be drawn and what she was willing to sacrifice for the stability of her role. The letters on her desk included messages of support from members of the public who had learned about the restructuring and wanted to express their continued respect for her service. Some of these correspondents seemed to understand intuitively what the institutional explanations had failed to capture, that the human cost of royal decision-making was real and significant, even when it was deemed necessary for larger purposes. One letter, from an elderly woman who had followed Camilla's journey from its earliest days, particularly resonated with her. Your Majesty, I hope you know that those of us who have watched you grow into your role understand that real people with real families are behind all the pageantry and protocol. We see your grace under pressure, and we appreciate the sacrifices you and your loved ones have made for all of us. The kindness and insight in these messages provided a counterbalance to the institutional coldness that had characterized much of the official response to the situation. They reminded her that her role as queen consort was ultimately about service to people who understood and valued the human dimensions of royal responsibility. 2 months had passed since the royal restructuring had turned Camilla's world upside down, and she found herself in the unexpected position of having discovered a different kind of strength through the process of loss and adaptation. The initial shock and pain had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more sustainable, an acceptance that was not resignation but rather a clearer understanding of what truly mattered in her life and role. The autumn weather had begun to change the landscape around her various residences, and she found herself drawing parallels between the seasonal transitions and her own internal transformation. Just as the trees were shedding their leaves to prepare for winter survival, she had been forced to let go of certain attachments and expectations that had previously defined her sense of security and belonging. Her relationship with Charles had weathered the crisis in ways that surprised them both. The initial tension and careful politeness had gradually given way to deeper conversations about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and the complex balance between personal happiness and institutional responsibility. They had both been forced to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the constraints and compromises that their positions demanded, but this acknowledgement had ultimately brought them closer together rather than driving them apart. "I think I understand now what you've been dealing with your entire life," Camilla said to him during one of their evening walks through the gardens at Highgrove. "The constant awareness that your personal preferences and relationships are subject to forces beyond your control, that even your most intimate connections can be affected by decisions made in the service of something larger." Charles nodded, his expression reflecting years of similar realizations and accommodations. "The difficulty is learning to find peace within those constraints rather than fighting against them. It's taken me decades to understand that accepting the limitations doesn't mean abandoning what matters most to you. It means finding different ways to protect and nurture those things." His words resonated with discoveries that Camilla had been making about her own capacity for adaptation and resilience. The restructuring had forced her family members to step back from their formal royal roles, but it hadn't diminished their importance in her life or their ability to provide support and companionship. If anything, the experience had strengthened their bonds by removing any ambiguity about their motivations and loyalty. Her brother Mark had handled his changed circumstances with characteristic military dignity, focusing on his private business interests and veteran support activities without any public complaints or criticisms. His ability to maintain his integrity and purpose despite the disappointment of losing his honorary positions had been a source of inspiration for the entire family. Annabelle had channeled her energy into new charitable endeavors that didn't require royal patronage, discovering that her effectiveness as an advocate and organizer was not dependent on official titles or ceremonial roles. She had found ways to support the same causes she cared about through different mechanisms, proving that meaningful service could continue regardless of formal recognition. Tom and Laura had both emerged from the experience with a clearer sense of their own identities and priorities, freed from some of the ambiguity and pressure that had come with their intermediate positions in the royal sphere. They had maintained their respect and affection for Camilla while developing a healthier distance from the institutional complexities that had sometimes made their relationships with her feel complicated. The public response to the family's grace under pressure had been largely positive, with many commentators noting the dignity with which they had handled their changed circumstances. This recognition had provided some compensation for the official diminishment of their roles, reminding them that their value and contribution were not solely determined by institutional approval. For Camilla herself, the experience had clarified certain fundamental truths about her position and her future. She had learned that her security as queen consort was not dependent on maintaining all of her previous relationships and connections in their exact same form. Instead, it required a more flexible understanding of how to balance her various responsibilities and loyalties. She had also discovered reserves of inner strength that she hadn't fully realized she possessed. The ability to continue performing her duties with grace and effectiveness, while processing profound personal disappointment, had revealed capabilities that would serve her well in future challenges. The experience had been painful, but it had also been educational in ways that would make her more resilient and effective going forward. One of the most significant changes had been in her relationship with the media and public attention. The coverage of the restructuring had been intense and often speculative, but she had found herself less affected by it than she might have expected. Perhaps because the real stakes had been so much higher, the well-being of her family members rather than just her own reputation, she had developed a clearer perspective on what aspects of public opinion actually mattered. The autumn brought a new series of royal engagements and ceremonial duties that provided opportunities to demonstrate her continued commitment to her role. A state visit from an important Commonwealth leader required weeks of preparation and careful diplomatic coordination, reminding her of the genuine importance and complexity of her official responsibilities. During the state banquet that concluded the visit, Camilla found herself seated next to the visiting dignitary's spouse, a woman who had also navigated the challenges of marrying into a prominent political family later in life. Their conversation revealed surprising parallels between their experiences of adapting to institutional constraints while maintaining personal authenticity. The hardest lesson, the other woman confided, is learning that you can't protect everyone you love from the consequences of your position. Sometimes the institutions we serve demand sacrifices that feel cruel and unnecessary, but fighting them openly usually makes things worse for everyone involved. The insight resonated deeply with Camilla's recent experiences, providing a broader context for understanding her situation. She was not alone in facing these challenges, and the difficulties she had encountered were not unique to her particular circumstances, but rather inherent in the nature of institutional power and responsibility. As the evening progressed, Camilla realized that she was genuinely enjoying herself in a way that had been difficult during the immediate aftermath of the restructuring. She was engaging authentically with her duties and her guests, drawing on all of her experience and skills without the underlying anxiety that had characterized many of her interactions during the crisis period. The drive back to Clarence's house that night provided time for reflection on how much her perspective had changed over the past few months. The same landscape that had seemed threatening and unstable during the height of the crisis now felt familiar and manageable. She had found her footing in the altered terrain of her circumstances, and she was beginning to see possibilities rather than just limitations. Charles was waiting for her when she arrived home, and she could see in his expression the relief and pride that came with watching her emerge stronger from a difficult experience. They shared a quiet drink in his study, surrounded by the books and artifacts that had provided comfort during the darkest moments of the previous months. "I've been thinking about what we want the rest of our time to look like," he said thoughtfully. "Not just what we're required to do or what others expect from us, but what we actually want to accomplish and how we want to be remembered." The question felt both liberating and daunting, representing a shift from reactive crisis management to proactive planning and intentionality. For the first time in months, Camilla felt capable of thinking beyond the immediate challenges to consider longer-term goals and aspirations. "I think I want to be remembered as someone who served with dignity regardless of the circumstances," she replied. "Someone who honored her commitments and protected the people she loved, even when it required difficult compromises and sacrifices." As she prepared for sleep that night, Camilla felt a sense of peace that had been absent during the tumultuous weeks following the restructuring. She had not just survived the crisis, but had grown through it, developing a deeper understanding of herself and her role that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The photographs on her dressing table no longer seemed to mock her with images of a simpler past, but rather reminded her of the continuity of love and connection that had sustained her throughout all of life's changes. Her family remained her family, regardless of their official status. Her marriage remained strong despite institutional pressures, and her sense of purpose remained clear even as its expression had been modified by circumstances beyond her control. Tomorrow would bring new duties and new opportunities to serve, and she felt ready to meet them with the wisdom and resilience that had been earned through months of uncertainty and growth.